Hello, everybody. It's Mary Alice here. So glad to welcome you to the bonus section of Story the Future Online Summit, because this is where we get to speak to some really interesting voices around the world about the work they're doing in story and take a look at some of the many facets of how story is working and how you can work with story. So it's really a pleasure to welcome Dr. Amit Nagpal here to our bonus section of the summit, and to welcome his voice into the circle. So glad to have you. And Dr. Nagpal is sitting around Delhi in India, as I'm in Ohio at the moment. So we're kind of like this meeting of East and West at this moment in our conversation. And actually I wanted to start there. You have a very special interest as a business storyteller on personal branding, on social and online media. And I love how your bio says your 6 words to tell your life story are from marketer to professor to storyteller, which is quite cool as a bio. But I wanted to start by asking you about your own upbringing with story. How does story work in your family structure and in the society of India as a whole?
Good evening, Mary Alice. One thing which I very particularly remember is that my grandmother's sister used to come to our house frequently, and she used to share wonderful stories with wonderful pearls of wisdom. And one thing I would like to highlight here, that stories take you one level up from smartness to wisdom. And there is too much of talk going around smartphones, smart cities, smart this, smart that. But smart always has that outsmart along with it. But wise does not have outwise.
I like that. I'm going to remember that. So was it from the women in your family that you heard the most stories?
Yes, from the women in the family. And of course, the second part of the storytelling in Indian culture in my childhood was reading a lot of books, which is more ancient storytelling of Panchtantra, of Puranas. There were some specific publications, Amar Chitrakatha, and which were about Indian heroes, Indian battles, about Indian culture. Plus, there was this huge popularity of some of the traditional epics of India, which are Mahabharata, Ramayana, and there have been cases in India when these epics were being shown on television and the roads were completely empty, and to that extent that there were 1 or 2 cases where the electricity was cut during the epic, and people were so angry they burnt the electricity station.
You've interrupted our epic. What is that? So what of the storylines of one of the great Indian epics? Can you share one of those? Because those are still at work in culture today, aren't they?
In fact, Ramayana and Mahabharata both have very different storylines. While Mahabharata is interesting from the perspective of a feud within the family, when you have to, fight with your own people. And it talks about, there is a deep message which has also got the connection with the famous book Bhagavad Gita, which is derived from the teachings of Lord Krishna during Mahabharata. So, it talks about duty, or the Indian concept of dharma being above everything else. While Ramayana is another, kind of a story where there is extreme emphasis on duty, sacrifice, and, similar values.
So these are they still the underpinning values of society, or are things shifting over time?
I would say they have been very strong values till my generation, but the current generation, the values are shifting very fast, probably because of internet and international television channels and the global exposure. Few years ago, I read one very interesting article in Indian newspaper that when Indians go on vacation, they have a serious guilt. They try to do extra work before they go on vacation, and all this comes from the Indian epics, where there is so much talk of duty, and there is not so much talk of your rights, or I think there is overemphasis on duty also.
So these kind of threads of duty and sacrifice and supporting your family and your traditions, and do the epics also portray gender roles in a certain way?
Yes, they do. Particularly, I think women have done more sacrifice. Women have been, maybe mostly shown in more, divine goddesses kind of roles. Though, of course, there have been women villains also in the Indian epics. Not every woman is shown as a hero. But the amount of sacrifices which women do are, it far exceeds the amount of sacrifices men do in the Indian stories or Indian epics.
So how does it, with this new input, so it's almost like an East-West collision, isn't it? Actually, India is a bit of an East-West collision because of where it was in British rule being there for so long. So
Yes.
how are the stories impacting how things are developing, do you think?
True. So I think I personally, because I was fond of Japanese management, I did my internship in a Japanese multinational in India. So when I compare Japanese culture with Indian culture, I find one thing very clear, that Japan has an extremely Eastern culture, while India is somewhere between East and the West. We have absorbed a lot of Western values, maybe because we have been under British rule for a very long time. But in some ways, we can be extremely Eastern also at the same time. Like our epics are, because most of the storytelling in India comes from very ancient culture when we were also as Eastern as Japan was. So that story is still strongly Eastern.
So how would you define the differences, or say some of the differences between East and West?
Okay, I'll give you some interesting examples. One of my American friends, he has a Twitter profile which says, shameless self-promoter. So,
we just laugh at that.
An Indian can never imagine to say that. We feel so shy of self-promotion. I learned personal branding concept from William Arruda and Michael Margolis in US, and I had a tough time in India for the first 2 years because I was trying to introduce American way of personal branding in Indian culture. Indians definitely were very shy of self-promotion, personal branding. But over a period of time, when I was exposed to the power of storytelling, particularly by Michael Margolis, I did a Story University online course also with him. So I realized that stories create that win-win situation where the storyteller builds the brand and where the audience also gets some value addition, some humor, some entertainment, some wisdom, some learning. So, storytelling in that sense finds a very delicate balance and win-win situation where personal branding happens. At the same time, audience also has a value.
I spent almost 30 years living in New Zealand, and there's some of that culture mix there too. When you take the Maori population, the indigenous population, which is a very community-oriented group kind of consciousness. And I remember asking a question in a workshop once of something about your personal vision for the future, and someone came to me on the sideline and said, "I cannot do this because that has never been the way that we've focused as a community. It's not about me. It's about what is the community doing and what am I doing to uphold the community and support the community." So I got really clear that the orientation is quite different. This kind of very seeing things from a community lens and seeing things from an individualistic lens.
Right.
So how do you balance that?
Yes, I think I'll give you another interesting example that Americans have a very straightforward communication. while in India we have a very contextual culture. So if you really want to understand what an Indian means, you have to understand the body language. So there is a huge non-verbal communication, and sometimes there is a lot of hint language. Um, so in that sense, overall, the non-verbal contextual culture in India.
Yeah.
Like I'll give you one very interesting example. So typically, when one Indian goes to another Indian's house, and the host asks, "Would you like to have a cup of tea, or a cup of coffee, or a cold drink?" So usually the guest says, "No, please don't trouble yourself," things like that, because saying yes is considered discourteous.
Would that
Then,
be like too greedy? You have to do something for me.
right. Then the host actually reads the body language of the guest, and then sometimes the host may say, I'm also feeling like having a cup of tea, so let us have a cup of tea together. And then the guest says, okay, okay, then in that case we can have it.
So you have to know the context and play with that. That's interesting. One of our other speakers, Chine Smart, is from South Africa, and she said it's there very much a tradition. If somebody is leaving, you walk them all the way to their car. You stand on the road and you wave until they say goodbye. And when she came to the United States, she was incredibly shocked when she had met somebody in their home. They showed her to the door, and then they closed the door after her. And she said, I felt abandoned. Like, there you go. So a very different context.
Right. So the whole communication has to be understood in that context. The verbal and the non-verbal communication has to be combined and then interpreted. So sometimes I joke with my students, because I also teach digital marketing, that chatbots are having a tough time in India because machines do not understand all the hint language which Indians use, all the non-verbal communication which Indians do.
So when you're working with somebody, what really intrigued you about personal branding and the stories that go around that? Why did that come into your repertoire?
It has to be, I think let me share few of the characteristics of stories which will connect with the audience and simultaneously build the brand of the storyteller or the speaker. Like, I think there has to be some amount of vulnerability, some amount of authenticity, some amount of failure, struggle. And if those elements are missing in the story, then it will again sound pure self-promotion and audience will not be able to connect. And I think as a culture, we are very emotional people.
So that connection is needed. The story helps people to connect with each other.
Yes.
So I'm interested in the poster that's right behind you. Would you say something about it?
Actually, this poster communicates the lesson which I learned about, the personal branding concept in Indian context. The poster says, when you share inspiring success stories, a great personal brand is a gift from the universe. So this is what I understood, from Indian culture perspective, that your focus should not be on building a personal brand. Your focus should be on adding value to the audience's lives. Your focus should be on sharing an inspiring story, and the personal brand will automatically come back to you as a gift from the universe. So this is the approach, which worked very well in the Indian culture later on.
So it's almost like giving the story as a gift gives you a gift in return.
Very true. I think you can also correlate it with the secret or the law of attraction, that whatever you give to the universe, it flows back to you.
So what would be some advice you'd be giving to people you're working with about how to begin this process of personal branding?
I would say the first step in the personal branding process is self-awareness. self-awareness of you as an individual and self-awareness of your story. So your passions, your strengths, your values, they have to be understood, and then only you'll be able to share a story which will, connect with your audience.
Okay, so what could somebody ask themselves, or how would they actually work that process? Because personal branding is this idea out there that's being flung around a lot, but maybe people don't understand very much what it actually means. So it's more than a logo or a tagline or a this is what my business does statement. It's not a vision statement.
Right. So I think, okay, let me share a few more, modalities of the process. Like even Michael Margolis had made a very powerful statement that you are too close to your own story to see it objectively. So from that point of view, I would say sometimes when you want to understand your own strengths and weaknesses, when you want to understand your own passions, when you want to understand the perceptions that you create, when you want to understand yourself, it is very useful to take the help and ask your parents, your immediate family, your close friends, your close colleagues to, about all these questions. What are my strengths in your view? In fact, sometimes you will discover a lot of aspects about yourself which you never knew.
So I should ask them, do a bit of benchmarking how people see me and what I've offered.
Right. So that's the beginning of understanding yourself, developing better self-awareness. Sometimes I think when you write your own story, in the process you will develop better self-awareness when you write your own childhood experiences, your youth experiences, and then you may realize, okay, I have become this kind of a person because I had all these experiences. So you develop a stronger self-awareness as you start the process of storytelling.
What do you see are as I'm looking at from marketer to professor to storyteller, what are your personal, I guess, edges around your story practice? Where do you want to take it from here?
I think personal branding, storytelling, and beyond. It is the name of a book which I wrote 2 years ago. It has been an Amazon bestseller in India. It is still #1. And that book title actually portrays a lot of things about my path and my philosophy. So it starts with personal branding. It starts with, communicating your strengths, your achievements, because initially you have to talk about yourself. And then over a period of time, your network develops credibility about you and they will talk more about you and you need to talk about you less. So it starts with personal branding. It moves on to storytelling, more of inspirational storytelling. And then over a period of time, like I have this subtitle in the book, branding is just the journey, bonding is the destination. So I have also experienced that slowly you have to, shift your focus from branding or communicating your values and strengths to bonding or building deeper relationships, stronger collaborations, which will actually get you, business.
So from branding to bonding, I like that very much, and it's making me wonder how we can scale that up just from individuals or from a business perspective to more about communities, more about nations, more about parts of the world. That's kind of interesting. So how do you think that story can help us to heal and build something more than we have today? There seem to be a lot of conflicts in the world. Are you seeing any possibilities or any edges you find interesting?
Yes, I think storytelling has a very powerful way of healing or self-healing. And I think, when people are doing acts of violence, acts of anger and frustration, they are doing those acts because they are not doing the self-healing. If we start doing self-healing, that, suppressed emotions will be healed and the, probability of violence or frustration coming outside would, either come down or it will be significantly reduced. So that self-healing, now the point is, how do you do that self-healing? How do you use storytelling as a self-healing tool? So I will give you a few examples. Like, one is writing a personal diary, whatever negative experiences you have had, whatever negative emotions you have experienced. So write it in the diary, and if you feel comfortable, let it continue in the diary. If you feel uncomfortable, you can even tear those pages out of the diary. But the important point is, the emotions have to come out of your system, come out of your mind. So that's the, one thing. Secondly, I have also realized that creativity as a tool works in two very powerful ways. One, creativity in any form, be it storytelling, writing, painting, can express your emotions, both positive and negative, can release your suppressed emotions. So that is a very strong power creativity has, and storytelling is a very powerful creative form of expression. Um, so, so I think this has to be the starting process. And once we have healed ourselves of anything, be it an emotional baggage, be it a negative experience, and once we have healed ourselves, then we share that experience as an inspiring story that other people can also heal themselves. And, then it becomes an inspiration for others. I think that should be the next step in the journey.
Are there ways that you have seen that people can share those kind of stories well?
Yes. See, I think one is that I even recommend my clients, or when I speak to audiences, that there are some parts of the story which you are still struggling with, which are unresolved conflicts in your life. So those parts of the story, if it makes you very vulnerable, you can keep that part of your story to yourself, in the sense, write it in your personal diary. But when the healing process is over and then you start feeling comfortable, you don't feel too vulnerable about it, then you start sharing it with the public. So that sensitivity has to be understood, which I think comes with deep self-awareness.
So are people you're working with feeling comfortable about sharing their personal stories? Is that something people do in the workplace and in community?
Yes, of course. I focus more on the personal branding part rather than the healing part. Healing is something which is more of a personal passion rather than a profession.
Yeah.
But I also feel that unless you do the healing, your creative expression will carry that baggage, carry that cynicism, carry that negative emotions in your expression. So it is better to do that self-healing, and then your creative expression will become more inspiring, more energetic, more connecting with the audience over a period of time.
And I guess more clear of your own stuff, right?
Yes, of course.
I think that's an interesting thing to think about. What is and this is the kind of like the personal and the public of storytelling. Personally, yeah. How can I work with it to, and I think the most interesting part of the word emotion is the part that says motion. I think you're pointing to that of those things need to move in order to clear you up, in order to have you be able to focus on the next thing rather than get stuck.
Right.
So one way of not getting so stuck is to keep working with it.
Right. And I think, like you said, emotion fundamentally comes from the word motion. In fact, great stories, in my view, fundamentally move people. Mm-hmm. It may move people into laughter. It may move people into tears. It may move people into action. But they move you in some way. They move the storyteller. They move the audience.
And together, hopefully, we can make a new movement forward. I'm, I'm just thinking that word movement, which is actually part of the reason for inviting people on this summit to say, is there some movement story can help us to make towards the future? So when I say the words, story the future, what comes up for you?
It's actually a very interesting term you have coined because I think like Walt Disney or Steve Jobs have talked about. Even Steve Jobs has written somewhere that a storyteller is the most powerful person in the world because he imagines, he envisions the next generation. He, creates that idea. So, in that sense, I also believe that we have to imagine a new story to create a better world, to create a better future, to create a new story for the humanity. We have to imagine it first, then only it's going to happen.
Maybe that's a good thing for us to end on, to say, so everybody who's listening, please would you do some healing for yourself and take that opportunity to see what stories need to move, and then find out what stories move you, and help us all imagine what the future might look like if it were the best for you and for everybody. Thank you, Dr. Amit Nagpal, for joining us on the Story the Future Summit, and thank you all for listening.